Genesis 2 and 3 seems to indicate that mankind had conditional mortality with them having access to the tree of life and then being kicked out of the garden. How does this affect the future judgment? What happens to a person who dies without Christ? What is your take on eternal punishment, annihilation, etc.? How does the resurrection of the unjust fit into this?
Well, I mean, if Adam and Eve, again, I do believe they had conditional immortality. In other words, if they wouldn't have sinned and they perpetually abide in the presence of God, essentially God's house, so to speak, Eden, they would have kept on living. Okay, so I would say it's conditional immortality. Everybody has, if we want to reverse the language, everybody's mortal. They're gonna die of something. So I'm given the way I'm adjusting the wording here, I'm not quite sure what is sort of troubling, Mark, to ask the question, but I'll take a stab at it. I mean, if they're kicked out of the garden, and really the rest of humanity sort of follows this template that we aren't born into the presence of God, we are, have to be brought back into relationship with God. That's just another way of saying salvation is needed. So that is, kind of the one thing that to me just seems the most obvious. If we're going back to the Edenic scene and then thinking about it theologically, what happens to a person who dies without Christ? Well, they have a Christless eternity. They spend eternity outside the presence of God, the family of God. They, to use other scriptural language, they're lost. That sort of thing. That naturally takes us into where the questioner took us. What's your take on eternal conscious punishment or annihilation, so on and so forth? I think for me, both of those things are actually still on the table. And I've said before on the podcast that it really depends on how you read certain language, especially in the Book of Revelation when it describes final judgment. So when I look at it, the thing that really puts annihilation on the table for me is the reference to the death of death, both in Revelation and also one place in 1 Corinthians. If death itself is truly destroyed, and that is what you actually read in the book of Revelation, then I don't know how death could be eternally ongoing. It's either destroyed or it's not. And so annihilation seems to make a lot of sense in respect to that verse. And of course, if you have annihilation, that's permanent. So the judgment is permanent. The separation is permanent. Does it have to be conscious? Is really the question for some people. And some will take like Revelation 14:11, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. Well, if they were destroyed, again, the results of that are permanent too. And the smoke could just be a reference to the fact that they had been destroyed. They had been consumed and annihilated in the flames. So the language of going up forever and ever just doesn't really help resolve the debate. That's part of why there is a debate. So I think for me, both of those things are on the table. If push came to shove, I think annihilation makes the best sense, but it's certainly not the only view that you could come out of that passage, and at least one other with. Again, it's hard for me to see how death itself could be destroyed and yet be ongoing in an eternal way. Those two things just don't seem to go together. But again, I'm not willing to to sort of push the more traditional view to the side. But I think annihilation really needs serious consideration. And like I said, for me, they're both on the table.